In the modern world of soccer, Andrea Pirlo is remembered as one of the greatest minds to ever orchestrate a match. He was the heart of AC Milan during their golden era, where he won two Champions League titles, 2003, 2007, two Serie A titles, and many other domestic cups, establishing himself as an icon of artistic, possession-based play. With the Italy national football team, Pirlo reached his peak by helping the squad win the 2006 FIFA World Cup, where he was honored as one of the tournament's standout players, made the FIFA World Cup All-Star team, and went on to appear consistently in the FIFA Pro World Divine. When he moved to Juventus, many thought he was past his prime, but Pirlo led the team to 4 consecutive Serie A titles, along with other domestic honors, while also reaching the Champions League final in 2015. He was named Serie A Player of the Year multiple times, proving he wasn't just a great player, but a conductor who shaped an entire generation of soccer. But behind those glittering trophies lies a journey full of wounds that not everyone sees. Pirlo was once considered too slow, too weak to survive in the brutal environment of top-level soccer, especially during his tough years at Inter Milan, where he was sidelined and nearly lost himself. He endured long nights of doubt, where his talent went unrecognized and his future looked bleak. The painful defeat in the 25 Champions League final wasn't just a professional shock, but a mental scar that lingered for years. Yet in that silence, Pirlo chose to carry on, not with noise or defiance, but with absolute conviction in himself. He turned criticism into fuel, loneliness into strength, and step by step proved that genius doesn't need to be loud to change the world. If Andrea Pirlo's story makes you see soccer in a completely different way, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the emotional journeys ahead. Pirlo grew up in Brescia, a quiet city in northern Italy, where his family's life wasn't lacking in comfort. He didn't have to struggle with poverty like many other legends. But that stability didn't give him a sense of belonging. Even as a child, Andrea Pirlo was quietly different in a way that was hard to understand. He spoke little, didn't like jumping into noisy conversations, always stood on the edge of any group of friends more as an observer than a participant. And even on the soccer field, which should have been a child's freest space, Pirlo wasn't like the others. While kids his age chased the ball with all their energy and impulsiveness, he moved slowly, almost detached, his eyes always tracking the ball's path before it arrived, as if he saw something no one else could. But that very difference made him isolated. In youth teams, coaches would shake their heads when watching Pirlo. They saw a player lacking speed, lacking strength, lacking everything modern soccer demanded. They said he was too slow, too weak, that he couldn't survive in a world where everything moved at storm-like speed. Those judgments, whether casual or blunt, gradually sank into the mind of a boy who already spoke little, making Pirlo withdraw even more, stay even quieter. Not because he didn't want to prove himself, but because he didn't know how to explain his way of seeing soccer. To him, soccer was never just about running faster or hitting harder than others. Soccer was space, time, the gaps that only the patient could notice. But at an age when other kids just needed to score to be recognized, those thoughts felt too alien, and Pirlo slowly became a misunderstood child, a child, caught between two worlds. One noisy world where everyone ran non-stop, and one quiet world in his mind where everything moved slower, clearer, but also lonelier. And that loneliness over time didn't fade. Instead, it grew, sinking deep into how he thought, how he felt, and eventually became an inseparable part of who he was a part the world would later call the calm of genius. But back then, it was simply the isolation of a child who never truly belonged anywhere. And then, when Andrea Pirlo took his first steps into professional soccer with Brescia Calcio, people thought his talent would finally be recognized. That once he left the vague, impatient world of youth fields, Pirlo would find his place in real soccer, but reality was far crueler. At the professional level, there was no room for difference unless it delivered instant results. Pirlo, with his slow, calm, almost detached style amid the chaos of a match, felt more out of place than ever. Coaches saw his technique, they couldn't deny it. They saw passes accurate to the centimeter, silky ball control that was rare, a mind that could read the game in ways few could. But all of that still seemed insufficient to save him from the repeated, cold, painfully simple verdict: he's too slow. In Italian soccer at that time, where power, speed, and fierce collisions were the standard for survival, that verdict was almost a sentence of full stop, written before the story could even begin. Pirlo wasn't the type of player people were looking for. He didn't battle fiercely, didn't charge like a storm, didn't make crowds leap to their feet with bursts of pace. He just moved quietly, held the ball, observed, and waited, as if playing an entirely different game on the same field. And that made him more misunderstood, more doubted, because to many, that slowness wasn't a sign of intelligence, but of weakness, of limitation, of a player unable to adapt to the harsh demands of elite soccer. There were moments when even Pirlo started feeling the weight of those judgments, when every touch became a test instead of a natural act, when every movement was scrutinized, when the silence that had been his refuge turned into a wall separating him from the world around him. And in that silence, Pirlo gradually realized he was standing on a fragile line between becoming an overlooked genius and a name quickly forgotten, because in a world that always demanded speed, no one had the patience to wait for someone who played in his own way. And then the dream that seemed like it would change everything arrived when Andrea Pirlo joined Inter Milan, one of Italy's biggest clubs, a place any young player dreamed of stepping into, where bright lights and crushing pressure coexisted. In that moment, people thought Pirlo had finally stepped onto the path to glory, that his talent would be honed and shine on the big stage. But reality wasn't what he had imagined. Inter wasn't a place for patience, and certainly not for a player like Pirlo, one who needed time, space, absolute trust to grow something he never truly received there. Instead, he was pulled away from himself, placed in unsuitable positions, asked to play in ways he didn't understand or feel. Day by day, Pirlo became a misfit piece in a system never built to hold him. He was pushed higher up the field, then pulled back. His role changed constantly like an experiment with no solution, and when he couldn't meet those misplaced expectations, he was relegated to the bench, where time dragged slowly and heavily, where a young player began doubting himself not for lack of talent, but because no one believed in that talent anymore. Then came the loan moves, like a silent admission that Inter didn't know what to do with him, that he wasn't their future. In the media's eyes, Pirlo's story shifted from hope to disappointment, from potential to doubt. They started writing cold lines that maybe he was just overhyped talent, a player who couldn't adapt to top soccer, a name that would soon vanish from the big headlines. For a player barely over 20 years old, those judgments weren't just pressure. They were a near final sentence before it had truly begun. Pirlo didn't fight back. He didn't speak out, didn't try to explain. He just stayed silent, but inside, that silence grew heavier because he understood that if nothing changed, if no one truly saw the real him, his career would end right there, in the shadow of a dream that had turned into a nightmare. And when the light had just begun to peek through after years that seemed destined for oblivion, Andrea Pirlo stepped into a new chapter in his career by joining AC Milan, one of the world's richest clubs in tradition and pressure, under the guidance of Carlo Ancelotti, who continued to trust the role Pirlo had just discovered. But even in that place, regarded as a paradise for stars, the doubt didn't vanish, because top-level soccer doesn't easily forgive what doesn't fit its standards, and Pirlo, with his slender frame, slow strides, and near absolute silence remained a big question mark for many. Could a player like that truly become the center of a big club? Could he withstand the pressure? Could he dictate the tempo in matches where every mistake came at a cost? The suspicious glances were no longer as overt as in his Inter days, but they still lingered, quiet and persistent, like a shadow trailing him with every step. And Pirlo, as always, didn't argue back, didn't speak out. He didn't try to convince anyone with words, because he understood that some things can only be proven on the pitch. And so, match after match, touch after touch, pass after pass, Pirlo began answering all those questions in the only way he knew how, with icy precision, with the ability to control the rhythm that forced the entire game to slow to his will, with those long passes that tore defenses apart, as if only he had seen the opening before it appeared. Gradually, the noise around him began to fade, not because people stopped doubting, but because they no longer had reason to doubt. Pirlo didn't transform into a faster, stronger, or louder player. He remained the same quiet, reserved, almost detached figure amid the surrounding chaos. But that very quality became the foundation of Milan's stability. While other stars shone through explosive moments, Pirlo shone through control, through the way he kept everything running smoothly, like a conductor who doesn't need to stand center stage yet, directs the entire orchestra from behind. And the most painful yet most beautiful thing in that journey was that Pirlo never changed to fit the world. He simply waited for the world to have enough time to understand him. And when that happened, no one saw a sluggish player anymore. They saw a brain, a heart of the team, someone whose silence spoke louder than any words. From a boy once deemed unfit, once standing on the sidelines of the dream, Pirlo now stood at the center of one of the greatest clubs, not because he became like everyone else, but because he never stopped being himself. And that quiet steadfastness turned him into something soccer rarely produces, a genius who didn't need to prove he was a genius, because every pass he made was the clearest answer of all. And then, just when Andrea Pirlo seemed to have found peace in his role at AC Milan, when every pass of his became the heartbeat of the entire team, when the world finally began to understand and recognize him, soccer, like a cruel twist of fate, was about to deliver a challenge no one could have foreseen. The 2005 Champions League final night, a match where Milan entered as the stronger, more composed, more complete side. In the first half, everything unfolded exactly according to that perfect script. Milan led Liverpool 3-0, a gap that seemed impossible to close, a victory that felt all but secured, and right at the center of it all, Pirlo orchestrated the game as usual, calm, precise, without a trace of panic, as if he were conducting a symphony heading toward its climax. But then something inexplicable happened. The match began to slip out of control. Liverpool scored, then scored again, and then once more. In just a few fleeting minutes, everything Milan had built throughout the game crumbled before their eyes. In that moment, there was no more tactics, no more control, only chaos that even Pirlo, the man who always saw everything ahead of time, could not stop. He still passed the ball, still tried to hold the rhythm, but for the first time, the game no longer obeyed him. It turned wild, unpredictable, and Milan, the once perfect team, now became terrifyingly fragile. When the match stretched into penalties, fear replaced confidence, and when the defeat was finally confirmed, when Liverpool completed one of the greatest comebacks in history, Pirlo stood there, silent, just as he had always stood. But this time the silence was no longer control. It was an emptiness, a void no words could describe. Later, he admitted it was one of the most painful nights of his life, not just because of the loss, but because of how the loss happened, because of the helplessness of watching everything slip away with nothing he could do. And in that brief yet endlessly long moment, Pirlo was no longer the conductor directing the match. He was just a man standing amid the collapse, witnessing a perfect team shatter before his eyes. What made that pain cut even deeper was the fact that no one could explain why. There was no clear reason, no satisfying explanation. Only the memory of a night that should have ended in glory, but turned into a scar that never healed. A memory that, no matter how many more trophies he won later, no matter how many peaks he reached, always remained there, quiet yet persistent. Like a reminder that in soccer, just as in life, nothing is ever certain. And even those who understand the game the most cannot control everything. And after that night, when the cheers had faded away, when the stadium lights went out and the world began searching for explanations, Andrea Pirlo reacted in the way he always reacted. He didn't yell in the locker room, didn't smash anything, didn't stand in front of the media to blame or make excuses. He just stayed silent. A familiar silence, but heavier than ever before, because it was no longer the calm of someone controlling the game, but the mute stillness of someone who had just lost something they couldn't name. And that very silence caused many to misunderstand him. They looked at Pirlo and saw a cold person, seemingly unaffected by defeat, a player indifferent to the collective pain. Some even thought he was arrogant, that he stood outside the emotions of others as if he didn't belong to them. But no one truly knew that inside that quiet man, the pain hadn't disappeared at all. It simply wasn't shown outwardly. It existed quietly, deeply, and persistently, like a wound that doesn't bleed but never heals. Pirlo carried the memory of that match in every stride, in every touch of the ball. And there were moments when gains grew tense, when things started slipping out of control. That memory would return, not loudly, not fiercely, but quietly, slipping into his mind like a reminder that everything could collapse at any moment. And what made that pain even harder to bear was that he didn't share it with anyone, didn't seek sympathy, didn't let anyone see his vulnerability. Because Pirlo wasn't that kind of person. He didn't believe in releasing emotions through words. He believed in endurance, in keeping everything inside and moving forward. And over time, that created a distance between him and the world around him. A distance even his teammates found hard to cross. They saw a Pirlo who was always calm, always in control, but they didn't see what he had to carry to maintain that calm. And sometimes that silence became the heaviest burden of all, because it didn't allow him to escape the past, didn't allow him to forget. It forced him to live with it, to accept it as part of himself. And perhaps it was in his loneliest moments, when no one was around, when there were no more matches to focus on, that Pirlo truly felt the weight of that silence, a weight invisible, yet always present. And the sad thing is, in a world that always praises those who show strong emotions, those who shout, resist, and express themselves, Pirlo chose the opposite path, the path of quietness. And because of that, he was misunderstood, misjudged, seen as distant, when in reality, he was just trying to keep himself from falling apart. And perhaps the greatest tragedy wasn't that he had to endure that pain, but that he had to endure it alone. No one knew, no one saw, only him and the endless silence, like an inseparable part of the life he chose, or perhaps the life that chose him. And then time passed, not loudly, not hurriedly, just like Andrea Pirlo himself. 2 years after that haunting Istanbul night, he stood once again on Europe's biggest stage with AC Milan, facing the very opponent that had once stolen his dream, Liverpool. But this time, everything was different, because Pirlo was no longer someone trying to control a perfect match. He was someone who had learned to live with imperfection, someone carrying the scar of failure and understanding that nothing is ever certain. And that very thing made him different. In the 2007 Champions League final, Pirlo didn't need to run more, didn't need to prove anything with flashy actions. He just did what he had always done: dictate the tempo, keep everything steady, read the game as if he were reading a book, only he understood. And in every pass, every decision, there was a profound calm he hadn't possessed 2 years earlier. A calm built from pain, from the memory of defeat, and from the acceptance that sometimes control isn't about preventing everything from happening, but about responding correctly when things change. And when Milan scored, when the match gradually tilted in their favor, Pirlo still didn't change. He didn't celebrate too early, didn't let emotions sweep him away, because he knew exactly what it felt like when a game that seemed finished suddenly came roaring back. He had lived through it, and because of that, he kept himself in a state of balance, like an invisible pillar holding the whole team back from complacency. And when the final whistle blew, when Milan officially claimed victory, Pirlo didn't collapse in tears, didn't rush off in an explosion of emotion like so many others. He just stood there, quietly. But this time, that silence was no longer a burden. It was a release, a relief that came from finally being able to face his past without it crushing him. Because this wasn't just a win, this was redemption, not for others, but for himself, for the memory of that Istanbul night, for the helplessness he had carried for 2 years. And in that moment, Pirlo didn't erase the past. He accepted it, turned it into part of the journey, a part that had helped shape the person he had become. And perhaps that was the most important thing, because victories can come and go, trophies can be remembered or forgotten, but the way a person rises after failure, the way they confront pain and keep moving forward, that's what truly defines them. And on that night in Athens, Andrea Pirlo didn't just reclaim a trophy. He reclaimed himself a stronger, deeper, and more peaceful version. Still silent, still reserved as before, but inside no longer carrying the emptiness of defeat, but the solidity of someone who had walked through darkness and found light, not by running from it, but by stepping straight through it. And before that redemptive night in Athens, before the journey of overcoming the haunting shadow, there was another chapter in Andrea Pirlo's life, one the world could never forget, yet one he rarely spoke about: the summer of 2006, when he donned the colors of the Italy national football team and stepped into the 2006 FIFA World Cup, a tournament where the pressure came not just from soccer, but from an entire nation shaken by scandal, where fans' faith was wavering and the team carried the burden of salvaging national pride. In that context, Pirlo wasn't the loudest voice, wasn't the one rallying spirits, but he was the one the entire squad instinctively looked to whenever the match descended into chaos, because his presence brought something no one else could: stability, a sense that everything could still be controlled. Match after match, Pirlo didn't score many goals, didn't create explosive moments the way the media loved, but he orchestrated everything. Every rhythm, every space, every decision flowed through his feet, as if he were rewriting how soccer should be played. Then came the semi-final. In a moment when the whole world held its breath, Pirlo received the ball on the edge of the box. Instead of shooting, instead of doing what everyone expected, he chose a pass almost no one saw, threading through the defense to place the ball perfectly for Grosso to finish. In that instant, it wasn't just a goal created. It was proof of how Pirlo saw the game in a way others couldn't. And when Italy advanced to the final, the pressure grew even more immense, because it wasn't just a match. It was the moment an entire country had been waiting for. When the game ended in a draw and everything came down to penalties, Pirlo stepped up first, no hesitation, no show of emotion, no glance seeking encouragement. He placed the ball, looked at the goal, and struck, precise, cold, just as he always did, not because he felt no pressure, but because he had learned to live with it. And when the ball hit the net, it wasn't an explosive moment. It was a quiet one, where a man had overcome all the doubts, all the misunderstandings, to stand at the pinnacle of the world, not through speed, not through strength, but through intelligence, through patience, and through a silence that only the truly perceptive could understand. And if the Istanbul night was a scar that never healed, then the summer of 2006 was proof that even the deepest scars can become part of one's strength. that a person doesn't need to change their essence to reach glory, and that sometimes the quietest one speaks the loudest through the way they play. And then, as the glow of the 2006 summer slowly faded, as the titles seemed to cement Andrea Pirlo in an irreplaceable position, soccer once again proved its cruelty. In 2011, after nearly a decade of devotion to AC Milan, Pirlo received a cold message. His contract would not be renewed. No dramatic farewell. No promises of the future. Just a simple decision carrying the weight of rejection. At 32, an age when many players' careers begin to slow, people started speaking of Pirlo as a name belonging to the past. They said he no longer had the physicality, that his style no longer fit the increasingly brutal pace of modern soccer, that his time was over. Those words, though familiar, still brought a familiar yet painful sting. Because it wasn't the first time Pirlo had been underestimated, not the first time he'd been deemed not good enough, but this time was different. Because he had already proven everything, had won every title, had stood at the world's peak, and still faced doubt, still faced being discarded as if what he'd done wasn't enough to keep him there. And perhaps what made this moment so bitter wasn't Milan's decision to part ways, but the way it happened, quietly, without emotion, much like the way Pirlo had always lived. But this time, that silence wasn't his choice. It was imposed on him, a reminder that in soccer there is no absolute loyalty, nothing is forever, and even those who once defined an era can be replaced without explanation. Once again, Pirlo stood at a crossroads, once again placed in the position of the doubted, the one the world believed had reached his final limit. And in that moment, many probably thought this would be the natural end to a great career, that Pirlo would fade away, drift into the past like so many others. But they forgot one thing. This wasn't the first time Pirlo had been underestimated. And every time it happened, he didn't respond with words, didn't fight back. He just waited quietly. And in that quiet waiting, something always began anew, something the world had never truly learned from him. That being discarded isn't the end. Sometimes it's just the start of a chapter no one saw coming. And then, in the familiar silence the world had so often misunderstood, Andrea Pirlo made a decision that went largely unnoticed at the time. He joined Juventus on a free transfer, no grand unveiling, no bold declarations, just a 32-year-old player rejected by his old club, seeking one last chance to keep playing. In many eyes, it wasn't a game-changing signing, just a temporary fix, a name to fill a gap in the squad, nothing more, nothing less. But soccer, once again, chose to write a story no one could predict. From his very first matches, Pirlo didn't need time to adapt. He didn't need to prove himself with words. He just needed to touch the ball. And from that moment, everything began to change. Juventus, a team that had lost its identity for years, gradually rediscovered its rhythm, not through explosion, but through control. And at the center of it all was still Pirlo. Still that quiet man standing in midfield, not running more, not speaking more, but making the entire match revolve around him. Season after season, Juventus began winning, then kept winning, then dominated Serie A in a way no one anticipated. In that journey, Pirlo didn't score many goals, didn't become the headline star the way other icons often did. But he was the soul of the team, the one connecting everything, the one keeping it all running smoothly. And the most remarkable thing was that he did it all without changing himself, without becoming faster or stronger, without becoming louder to get noticed. He remained Pirlo, the same man once called too slow, too weak, once discarded as part of the past. But now that very man stood at the heart of a new empire. And perhaps what made this story so special wasn't that Pirlo succeeded again, but how he did it, not through loud revenge, not through retorts, but through silence, a silence strong enough to force the whole world to look again, to question how many times they had been wrong about him. In Juventus's dominance in the consecutive trophies lifted high, Pirlo didn't just beat opponents. He beat the prejudices that had once weighed him down. He proved that genius doesn't need to shout to be heard, that sometimes silence is the most powerful answer of all. And when history looks back on that era, people may remember the titles, the victories, but deeper still, they will remember a man who turned silence into strength and turned seemingly simple passes into something that reshaped the entire landscape of soccer. And when the cheers gradually died down, when the trophies were no longer the center of every story, another side of Andrea Pirlo began to emerge. A side that fans rarely saw because off the pitch, Pirlo was almost a completely different person. No longer the conductor dictating the game's tempo, no longer the focal point of blazing lights, but a quiet man seeking peace in simple things. He loved wine, not as a luxurious hobby, but as a way to slow down, to feel time in a different rhythm. Much like the way he once played soccer, he preferred private spaces, far from the noise of the media, far from the eyes always searching for emotion in him. Because Pirlo had never been comfortable being a public figure in the conventional sense, he didn't like explaining himself, didn't like sharing too much, not because he had nothing to say, but because he always chose to keep everything inside, just as he had throughout his career. But even in that silence, his personal life went through upheavals that not everyone knew about. Marriage, family, relationships that changed over time, moments that even someone as composed as Pirlo couldn't control. He got married, built a family, became a father. But then, like so many stories in life, not everything went according to plan. The marriage ended, leaving behind not just legal changes but complex emotions that a person like Pirlo rarely showed outwardly. And, once again, he chose to face it in silence, no statements, no lengthy explanations. Just a quiet acceptance that life, like soccer, can't always be controlled. And that some things, no matter how well you understand them, can still slip through your fingers. But what makes Pirlo's story special isn't that he went through those events. It's the way he lived with them. He didn't let personal changes strip away his essence, didn't let wounds turn him into someone else. He remained that quiet man, still seeking balance in simple things, still keeping a distance from the outside world, not to escape, but to protect the inner part he always kept private. And perhaps this part of his life truly reveals the real Pirlo, not the genius on the field, not the icon of trophies, but an ordinary man with small joys, private sorrows, failures that weren't broadcast on television. And in that ordinariness there is a beauty few recognize, because it's not loud, not dramatic, but real. And that very authenticity is what helped Pirlo endure through everything, through years of doubt, through peaks of glory, and through the personal upheavals no one could see. Because in the end, when everything has passed, what remains isn't the titles or the famous moments. It's the person. And Pirlo, no matter the circumstances, has always remained himself a quiet man, but never a weak one. And then, when all the sounds of his career gradually faded into the background, when the stadiums were no longer where he appeared every week, Andrea Pirlo's story truly became clear in a way no one had been patient enough to see before. Because for more than 2 decades he had lived 2 parallel lives, one that the whole world saw and one that almost no one understood. The first life was the image etched in fans' memories, a soccer genius, a World Cup champion who stood at the center of the greatest teams, dictating the game's tempo as if time itself had to listen to him. Pirlo's passes weren't just technique, they were language. His way of speaking to the world without opening his mouth, from AC Milan to Juventus, from Champions League nights to the pinnacle. With the Italy national football team in 2006, he always appeared as something different. Not loud, not overpowering with physicality, but controlling everything with intelligence and calm. He didn't need to run faster than his opponents because he always thought faster than them. He didn't need to shout to lead because a single touch of the ball was enough to make the entire team move to his will. And that's why the world called him a genius, an artist, the conductor of modern soccer. But that was only half the story, because behind all those perfect moments was the second life. One no trophy could lighten, the feeling he carried for years, doubt not from others, but from within himself. A man who grew up feeling he didn't fully belong to any mold, too slow for Italian soccer, too quiet for a world that always demanded strong personality, too different to be easily accepted. And even after conquering everything, those doubts never completely vanished. They just became quieter, like the man himself. And perhaps that's what makes Pirlo so special. Not that he never failed, but that he lived with those failures without letting them define him. From the lost years at Inter Milan, to the moment he nearly lost his career when he was still so young. From the pain of the Istanbul night in 2005, to the skepticism when he was deemed past his prime at 32, all of it could have broken someone else. But for Pirlo, it became part of the journey, part of the person he was slowly becoming. And the astonishing thing is that he never changed the way he existed to fit the world. He forced the world to learn to understand him, little by little, with near-infinite patience, with faith in something not everyone could see right away. And that patience, more than any trophy, is the greatest legacy he left behind. Because in an era where everything happens fast, where a player's value is often measured by speed and power, Pirlo proved there is another path. A path of stillness, of thought, of understanding the game more deeply than anyone else. And when looking back on his entire journey, people don't just see a great player. They see a man who lived true to his essence despite every doubt, despite every prejudice. And that's what makes his story transcend soccer. It doesn't just talk about how to win on the pitch. It talks about how to exist in a world that always tries to define you on its own terms. Pirlo didn't fight the world. He didn't try to change it with force. He just quietly walked his own path. And, in the end, that very path changed the way the world sees soccer, as well as the way we understand greatness. Because some people don't need to be loud to become immortal. They just need to be patient enough to wait for the world to catch up to them. And Andrea Pirlo is one of those, a genius who never stopped believing in himself, even when no one else did. Some players dominate the game with power. Andrea Pirlo changed it with silence. The story of Andrea Pirlo leaves a very quiet, almost melancholic feeling. Not because he failed, but because he had to live too long in misunderstanding. And that very thing makes his journey both beautiful and painful. From his early days at Brescia, when he was labeled too slow, to the lost period at Inter Milan, where he was constantly shifted positions and benched, to the moment in his 20s when he nearly lost all faith in himself. Pirlo wasn't just fighting opponents. He was fighting the feeling that he didn't belong in this world. Even at his peak, the pain lingered. The Istanbul night in 2005 when AC Milan collapsed after leading 3-0, or the heavy silence he carried after that defeat, showing a man who didn't know how to release emotions the usual way. And then, when deemed finished at 32 and rejected by AC Milan for contract renewal, Pirlo was once again pushed to the margins, only to quietly rebirth at Juventus, proving everything with passes instead of words. What makes people feel for him isn't those failures themselves, but the way he always had to endure them in silence, even in his personal life, with the breakdown of his marriage that he never explained publicly. But that very silence became his greatest strength. For American audiences, where success is often tied to self-promotion and bold personality, Pirlo's story is a profound reminder that not every path to greatness is loud. Some people win through patience, through knowing their own worth, even when the world hasn't yet recognized it. Pirlo didn't just change how the game is played. He changed how we understand success. Sometimes the greatest power isn't in shouting louder than others, but in holding firm to yourself when no one is listening. If Andrea Pirlo's story makes you pause and reflect, please hit subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring more quiet but great journeys like this one together. Thank you for listening all the way to the end, and see you in the next video, where the stories that aren't loud but touch deep into the heart keep being told.